In 1957, you were 12, and you already knew the rhythm of it. The bell over the door, the hiss of the grill, the counter stools spinning if you pushed too hard, and nobody stopped you. S.H. Kress wasn't a restaurant. It was a five and dime with a soul, where you bought thread and a hairbrush, then sat at a marble counter and ate like the war was finally over. A quarter bought you abundance on a heavy white plate with a blue stripe. That counter is gone now. Not faded, gone. Buildings gutted into parking structures and pharmacies. The last Kress closed in 1981, and nobody noticed. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. These dishes were engineered for a world that valued your time enough to cook for you properly. We traded that. We didn't have to. Let's go back to the counter. Number 25. The pork tenderloin sandwich. In Knoxville, the counter cook took a cut of pork loin and pounded it flat with the side of a heavy plate. Not a mallet, a plate, because that's what was within reach, until it was nearly translucent at the edges. Breaded in cracker meal, dropped into hot lard until it went the color of a new penny. Then it came out so wide it hung a full inch off both sides of the bun, curling up at the corners like it was trying to escape its own sandwich. 15 cents, 1950s prices, and it fed a working man through a full 8-hour shift at the rail yard. The bread was almost an afterthought. You were there for the pork, crisp enough to crackle when you bit through it, the inside still faintly pink and impossibly tender for something that cost less than a stamp. Nobody fries pork this thin anymore. It takes a butcher who isn't watching the clock. Number 24, the fried catfish plate Memphis, 1950s, 20 cents. The catfish came out of the Mississippi that morning, not farmed, not flash frozen, pulled from the river by a man who sold it straight to the back door of the Kress kitchen before the counter even opened, dredged in stone-ground cornmeal, nothing else. No seasoning blend, no breading mix from a box. Salt, cornmeal, hot grease. It fried fast and hard, the cornmeal crust going dark gold and almost audibly crisp, while the fish underneath stayed white and flaked apart at the gentlest pressure of a fork. Beside it, hush puppies. The same cornmeal fried into rough little spheres, sometimes with a sliver of onion caught inside one if you were lucky. This was not a fish fry. This was a river economy, served on a plate for a price that assumed you didn't have much to spend and gave you everything anyway. Number 23. The butterscotch sundae, Knoxville again, 20 cents. The butterscotch wasn't poured from a bottle. It was built every morning before the doors opened. Brown sugar and butter melted together slow on the steam table until it went dark and thick and faintly burnt at the edges, the good kind of burnt, the kind that tastes like caramel that almost went too far and didn't. 2 scoops of vanilla. The sauce ladled over hot, so it pooled and hardened slightly where it hit the cold ice cream, cracking when your spoon broke through. A scatter of chopped peanuts if the counter had them that week. They knew things about sugar and heat that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. A jarred sauce doesn't behave like this. It can't. It was never cooked long enough to learn how. Number 22. Black Bottom Pie Birmingham, 1950s, 15 cents a slice. This one had a secret, and counter regulars knew it without saying it out loud. A bottom layer of bittersweet chocolate custard, dense and almost fudge-like. Above it, a lighter rum-spiked custard, barely set, trembling slightly when the plate moved. A crown of whipped cream dusted with shaved chocolate. The bourbon, sometimes rum, depending on who was baking that week, wasn't decoration. It was there to cut the sweetness, to give the pie an edge that a child wouldn't fully understand and an adult would order twice. That is not progress. What replaced this? A pre-made pie shipped frozen in a truck is not progress. It is a specific loss dressed up in a box that says it isn't. Number 21. Lime Jello salad with cottage cheese, San Antonio, 15 cents. This is the dish people forget on purpose, the one that sounds strange now and was completely ordinary then. Lime gelatin, set with cottage cheese folded through it before it firmed, sometimes a few canned pineapple chunks suspended like they were caught mid-fall. It came to the table cold, wobbling slightly, cut into a clean rectangle. Grandma just called it a salad. Not dessert, not a joke, not something to be embarrassed about. A salad. It sat on the lunch plate next to the meat and the bread with total confidence, because in the 1950s, gelatin wasn't a punchline. It was modern. It was the future, served cold, number 20. The Waldorf salad plate, Los Angeles, 20 cents. Diced apple, celery, a small handful of walnuts if the counter could afford them that month, all of it bound together in real mayonnaise. Not a dressing, not a vinaigrette, just mayonnaise thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, served on a bed of shredded iceberg lettuce, because every plate in 1950s America needed a bed of shredded iceberg lettuce, no exceptions. It was built almost entirely from things sitting in any grocer's bin: apples, celery, a jar of mayonnaise, and somehow it read as elegant. That was the trick of the counter. Take what's cheap. Make it look like it isn't. Number 19, tomato aspic salad, Atlanta, 1950s, 15 cents. If there is one dish on this entire list that belongs to the 1950s and no other decade, it's this one. Savory tomato juice, set firm with gelatin, sometimes studded with diced celery or a sliver of green pepper suspended inside like a specimen. It arrived on a chilled plate, sliced into a clean wedge, served with a small dollop of mayonnaise on the side. It was not a salad in the way we'd recognize one now. It was tomato soup that had learned how to stand up straight, and it disappeared completely, not faded out, not phased gently into something else. It vanished, almost overnight, by the late 1960s. Nobody under 60 has tasted it, number 18. The stuffed bell pepper plate, Houston, 1950s, 25 cents. A whole green pepper, the top sliced clean off and the seeds scraped out by hand, hollowed until it could hold a fist-sized portion of filling. Inside, ground beef stretched thin with cooked rice, diced onions sweated soft in bacon grease, a spoon of tomato sauce worked all the way through so the rice never dried out during the bake. The pepper itself went into a hot oven until the skin started to blister and pull away in places, the green going slightly olive at the edges, the whole thing collapsing just enough to be tender without losing its shape on the plate. This was a meal built on arithmetic, the kind of arithmetic a counter cook did in her head without ever writing it down. A half-pound of ground beef, on its own, fed maybe 2 people a thin meal, stretched with rice, onion, and a pepper from the garden out back or the produce stand 2 blocks over. That same half-pound became 4 full plates. Heavy plates, the kind that left you full until supper. Nobody called this thrifty out loud, because thrifty implied a choice, a virtue you'd selected from a list of options. This wasn't a choice. This was Tuesday. They called it dinner, and it tasted like considerably more than what went into it, which was, in the end, the entire and only point of the dish, number 17. The meatloaf plate, Nashville, 25 cents, and this was the Tuesday special. Not by accident, but by design, because Tuesday was the day the week's beef trimmings, the odd cuts the butcher couldn't sell whole on Saturday, came in cheap to anyone willing to grind them down. The counter cook bound the ground beef with breadcrumbs soaked soft in milk, an egg to hold it together, finely diced onion and a little black pepper, then packed it into a loaf pan and brushed the top with a glaze of ketchup, mixed with a spoon of brown sugar before it went into the oven. It baked low and slow until the glaze caramelized into something close to candy at the edges. Dark, slightly sticky, almost burnt in the good way, while the inside stayed moist enough to need no gravy at all, though there was always gravy anyway. Beside it sat mashed potatoes, whipped with real butter and whole milk until they held no lumps, a deep well pressed into the center with the back of a spoon, waiting to be filled. The gravy itself came from the meatloaf's own drippings, scraped from the pan and thickened with a little flour. Nothing bought separately, nothing wasted. Nothing wasted. That was the whole philosophy of the plate, stated in 3 words, and nobody at the counter needed it explained to them twice. Number 16. Chicken fried steak Dallas, 25 cents. The cut was round steak, the toughest, cheapest piece available off the back end of the cow, the kind of cut that would fight you through an entire meal if it wasn't handled right. The counter cook pounded it flat with a meat mallet. Sometimes the same heavy plate used at the pork tenderloin station, whatever was closest, until the muscle fiber gave up its structure entirely, and the steak lay thin and pliable on the cutting board, dredged first in seasoned flour, then dipped into buttermilk, gone slightly thick and tangy, then dredged again, a double coat, and that second pass through the flour was the difference between a crust that shattered cleanly under a fork and one that went soft and disappointing the moment gravy touched it. Fried in a cast-iron skillet, the same skillet used every single day for a decade, in grease that had taken on its own deep flavor from years of use. The crust came out a heavy, almost mahogany gold, audibly crisp when you cut into it. This was not a steak, not really, not in the way the word usually promised something. This was an entire, cheap, tough cut of meat being argued into tenderness through technique alone, because the kitchen budget couldn't afford to argue with the butcher's prices instead. Served under a blanket of white cream gravy, peppered hard enough that your eyes watered a little on the first bite, and nobody at that counter ever apologized for it. Number 15. The beef stew plate, Knoxville, 20 cents. The pot went on the back burner before the doors even opened, sometimes before sunrise. Beef chuck, another tough, cheap cut, the kind that punished you if you tried to cook it fast, cubed and browned first, then left to simmer for hours with carrots cut into thick rounds, potatoes quartered so they'd hold their shape, and a whole onion sliced in to melt down into the broth and disappear almost entirely by the time the lunch rush hit. By noon the meat had given up completely, gone fall-apart tender on its own terms, no force required, just heat and patience working together the way they always do when a kitchen has nowhere else to be. It was served over a scoop of white rice, or, on the days the rice ran out, ladled directly over a thick slice of white bread laid flat in the bottom of the bowl, the bread soaking up the broth until it went soft and rich and almost custardy underneath. That was it. That was the entire dish, start to finish. A pot, a low flame, a few cheap vegetables, and time, the one ingredient that has never cost a single cent and that almost nobody, in any kitchen anywhere, is willing to spend anymore. Number 14. The Salisbury steak plate, Birmingham, 25 cents. Ground beef formed into a tight oval patty, mixed through with finely diced onion and breadcrumb the same way the meatloaf was. The counter kitchens at Kress ran on a handful of base techniques, repeated and renamed across a dozen dishes, but this one was shaped and seared in a hot skillet like it was claiming to be a cut of steak it never actually was. The patty went into the pan hard enough to develop a real crust on both sides, then simmered briefly in a gravy built from sautéed mushrooms, beef stock, and a touch of flour to thicken it, until the gravy clung to the meat instead of pooling thin around it. Served alongside green beans, cooked down low and soft for the better part of an hour, with a piece of fatback tucked into the pot, the beans losing their bright color entirely in exchange for a deep, savory flavor that no quick-blanched vegetable could ever match. This was not steak. Everyone at the counter understood that, the cooks included. This was ground beef, given a name dignified enough to sit proudly on a quarter's worth of plate without apology, and nobody was fooled by the name for even a second. They didn't need to be. The name was never the point of the dish. The gravy was. There's a number that almost never comes up when people talk about counter food with that slightly embarrassed kind of nostalgia, like it was a guilty pleasure instead of an actual nutritional plan that worked month after month for decades. A typical 1950s blue plate special. A meat, two vegetables, bread, and a starch, delivered somewhere between 25 and 35 grams of protein per plate, alongside real fiber from whole vegetables cooked in their own fat rather than stripped, processed, and reconstituted into something shelf-stable. Period home economics surveys from land-grant universities tracking working-class diets through the 1950s consistently found that a counter meal under 30 cents outperformed, gram for gram of nutrition per penny spent, almost anything available in a grocery store at the same price point. Compare that to a modern fast food value meal. More calories, often by a wide margin. Less protein relative to those calories. Almost no fiber that didn't arrive, already processed and stripped of half its structure before it ever reached the fryer. We were sold a story that fast food was an upgrade. Faster, cheaper, more efficient than a counter cook simmering a pot of stew for 6 hours. The efficiency part of that story was true. It was efficient at extracting more profit from less actual food. That is not progress. That is a nutritional downgrade wearing a drive-thru sign. Number 13. Chicken a la king on toast points. Los Angeles. 20 cents. Diced chicken, usually the meat picked clean off a bird that had already given up its bones for stock the day before, folded together with canned peas and sliced mushroom into a cream sauce, built the slow, correct way from a roux of flour and butter cooked together in a hot pan until it lost its raw, pasty smell and turned a pale gold, then thinned gradually with whole milk, whisked constantly so it never broke or went lumpy. The whole mixture simmered just long enough for the chicken to warm through and the sauce to thicken to the point where it coated the back of a spoon and held there. It was ladled generously over triangles of toasted white bread, the toast cut on the diagonal. Not for any practical reason, but because somebody, somewhere years before, had decided that a diagonal cut made canned peas and leftover chicken look like an occasion worth dressing for. It was a humble dish, wearing a French name it hadn't entirely earned, and the counter cooks knew it perfectly well. They served it anyway, with total confidence, because confidence cost nothing, and the chicken did. Number 12. Creamed chipped beef on toast, Memphis, 15 cents. Dried, heavily salted beef, sliced paper thin, almost translucent, so thin you could see the counter through it if you held a piece up to the light, folded into that same family of cream sauce, the roux thinned with milk until silky, poured generously over toast until the bread went soft and slightly translucent underneath, soaking up everything it could hold. This dish came home from the war, riding along in the memories of the men who'd eaten it by the spoonful in mess halls overseas. And they didn't entirely want to leave it behind once they were home, even if they joked about it the same way they joked about most of what they'd seen in those years, sideways with a half-smile, so it wouldn't have to hurt as much as it did. Grandma just called it chipped beef. She didn't know, or more likely didn't care, that half the men at her own table still called it something else entirely under their breath. An old service nickname nobody printed in a cookbook. She served it because it was cheap. It kept well in the pantry for months. It was filling on a cold morning, and her family ate every last bite of it without complaint. Number 11. Frito Chili Pie San Antonio, 15 cents, and this one is a genuine Texas invention, born at a counter not unlike this one. Chili, thick and deliberately beanless the way Texas chili insisted on being, simmered down dark with cumin and chili powder until it lost almost all its liquid, ladled directly into a bag of Fritos that had been split open down one side with a quick knife stroke, instead of poured into a bowl, topped with a fistful of shredded cheddar that melted on contact with the hot chili, then a scattering of raw diced onion for bite, eaten standing up at the counter, straight out of the bag, with a plastic spoon if the counter had one handy that day, and bare fingers if it didn't. Nobody much minded either way. There was no plate to wash afterward. No bowl to dirty, no extra dish for an already overworked kitchen to scrub at the end of a long shift. Just corn chips, chili, and the kind of practical, unglamorous genius that only ever comes out of a kitchen that has to move fast at lunch and clean up faster once the rush is past. Number 10. The Coney Hot Dog Atlanta, 10 cents. A snappy cased frankfurter, split lengthwise and laid flat on the griddle until both cut edges caramelized, dropped into a steamed bun, gone soft and warm from sitting over the grill's heat all morning. Buried under a no-bean chili sauce that had simmered down dark and thick enough to cling rather than run, finished with a handful of raw diced onion for crunch and a single confident stripe of yellow mustard cutting straight through the richness. It was built for a working lunch break that lasted exactly 15 minutes and not a second longer, eaten standing at the counter rail, gone in 6 bites or fewer, the whole transaction over almost before it began. This was not a hot dog in any casual, ballpark sense of the word. This was an entire working lunch disguised as a snack, engineered to put enough fuel into a man's stomach to carry him back onto the factory floor before the next whistle blew, with not one wasted minute spent sitting down. Number 9. The Denver sandwich, sometimes called the Western, depending on which side of the counter you grew up on. Knoxville, 15 cents. Eggs cracked straight into a hot pan and scrambled together with diced ham, finely chopped onion, and green pepper, the whole mixture folded between 2 slices of bread griddled in butter until it held together firmly enough to pick up with 2 hands and ate almost like an omelet that had simply given up trying to be polite about its shape. Served any hour the counter was open. Breakfast, lunch, or that strange dead hour in the middle of the afternoon when the kitchen had nothing fancier left to offer, and this was always, reliably, on hand. This was the original breakfast sandwich, decades before anyone thought to trademark the idea, bottle it up in branded paper, and start charging $6 for a thinner, colder, considerably worse version of the exact same thing. By 1965, S.H. Kress was already bleeding customers out toward the suburbs, toward the new shopping centers, toward the interstate exits, where drive-in chains were setting up shop with parking lots 3 times the size of any downtown five and dimes footprint. The corporation that finally bought what remained of Kress in 1980 wasn't particularly interested in the lunch counters at all. They wanted the real estate, the downtown lots, the buildings themselves, the land underneath them, and the lunch counters, along with the cooks who'd worked behind them for 20 and 30 years, were liquidated along with the stools and the cash registers and the marble. Genesco, the corporation behind the final sale, didn't preserve a single counter intact. They sold the marble off in pieces. They auctioned the stools. The recipes went nowhere because nobody in a position of any authority thought to ask the cooks to write a single one of them down before the doors closed for the last time. That is not a business failure. What happened here? That is a specific decision made by specific people sitting in a specific boardroom to treat 40 years of working-class culinary knowledge as nothing more than scrap value on a balance sheet. They knew things about feeding people well on a quarter that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember, piece by piece, recipe by half-remembered recipe. And the saddest part of all of it isn't even that the counters closed. It's that nobody in a position to stop it ever thought the knowledge sitting inside those kitchens was worth the paper it would have taken to save it. Number 8. Cream of mushroom soup, Birmingham, 10 cents a bowl, built from a real roux, butter and flour cooked together slowly in a heavy pot until the raw flour smell cooked away completely, then thinned gradually with stock and whole milk until the whole thing went velvet smooth, glossy, coating a spoon without a single trace of graininess. Fresh mushrooms, sliced thin by hand, sweated down low in butter until they gave up their water entirely and their flavor along with it, concentrated into something earthy and deep before they ever met the cream base. This was years before Campbell's Red and White became, for most of the country, the only version of this soup anyone would ever taste again. Thinner, sweeter, missing entirely the dark mushroom flavor that came from real fungus cooked down slow instead of flavor extracted and bottled. This was not condensed soup, reconstituted from a can with a splash of water stirred in. This was soup, made the long, patient way, back when the word still meant exactly what it said. Number 7. Chicken salad on toast, Nashville, 15 cents. Chicken poached whole and slow in a pot of barely simmering water with a bay leaf and a few peppercorns, then cooled and diced by hand once it was tender enough to fall apart under a fork. Mixed heavy on the celery, diced fine for crunch, and noticeably light on the mayonnaise. Counter portions ran leaner across the board than what we'd recognize as chicken salad today. Because mayonnaise cost real money by the jar and celery, grown in plenty just outside town, mostly didn't, served open-faced on a single slice of toasted white bread, with one curl of lettuce tucked underneath, mostly for color, mostly just to make the plate look like somebody had thought about it before it left the kitchen. It was a simple dish in every sense, asking nothing of you except the patience to let the chicken poach slow enough to stay tender all the way through. Number 6. The open-faced roast beef sandwich, Memphis, 20 cents. Beef roasted low and slow until it had given up nearly all its toughness, then sliced thin against the grain so every piece practically fell apart between your teeth, draped generously over a single piece of white bread and drowned. There is no gentler or more accurate word for what happened to that bread. In a brown gravy made entirely from the roast's own drippings, scraped from the pan and thickened over low heat, eaten entirely with a fork, start to finish, because the bread underneath had long since gone soft and structurally hopeless under the weight of all that gravy, and nobody at the counter minded that in the slightest. Today we call this exact dish a hot roast beef plate. Serve it in a gastropub with considerably less gravy and twice the unnecessary plating fuss, and charge $17 for it. The bones of the dish haven't changed one bit in 70 years. The honesty of it has. Number 5. Toasted ham and cheese, Los Angeles, 15 cents. Real butter, softened and spread generously, griddled into real white bread until both outer sides went deep golden brown and faintly crisp. A thick slice of ham laid in, a slab of sharp cheddar pressed flat on top of it until the heat of the griddle pulled the cheese down into every crevice of the toasted bread, melting it completely before the sandwich ever left the pan. No microwave existed anywhere near this counter, no shortcut available even to a cook in a hurry who might have wanted one. Just a flat-top griddle, real butter, and a spatula pressing down with exactly the right amount of patient, deliberate weight. That was the entire dish. Bread, butter, ham, cheese, heat. 4 ingredients and 1 hot surface, and somehow, every single time, it came out tasting like considerably more than the sum of those 4 humble parts ever should have. Number 4. The Reuben's Sandwich, Knoxville, 20 cents. And this one was still relatively new to most lunch counters in the 1950s, only recently having made its way out of delicatessen culture and into broader American eating. Corned beef sliced and piled high, sauerkraut drained well and warmed through on the griddle so it lost its raw bite, Russian dressing spread thick on both sides of rye bread, a slice of Swiss cheese laid over the top of it all, before the whole sandwich went onto the flat top to be pressed and griddled until the cheese melted completely and the kraut's sharp tang cut clean through the richness of the meat underneath. This was not a delicatessen dish slumming it uncomfortably at a 5-and-dime counter, settling for less than it deserved. This was the counter proving, sandwich by sandwich, that it could hold its own against any proper sandwich shop in town, for a fraction of what that shop would have charged for the same thing. Number 3. The cheeseburger deluxe, Dallas, 20 cents. A beef patty formed by hand, never pre-shaped, griddled hard and fast enough to develop a real deeply browned crust on both sides while staying juicy underneath. A slice of cheese melted directly on top in the last moments of cooking, lettuce, a thick slice of tomato, and a full pickle spear stacked on high enough that you needed both hands to manage it, and a genuine willingness to lose some of the juice and the toppings down your wrist before you finished. This was the counter's direct, unapologetic answer to the new drive-ins creeping in at the edge of every town. A clear declaration that a sit-down marble counter could move just as fast and taste twice as good as anything served through a car window. For about a decade, against all odds, it very nearly worked. Number 2. The deviled egg salad plate, San Antonio, 15 cents. Eggs boiled hard, halved cleanly down the center, yolks scooped out and mashed smooth with a spoon of mustard and a dollop of mayonnaise, then piped or carefully spooned back into the waiting whites and dusted with paprika until each half looked almost too composed and tidy to actually eat. Served 4 halves to a plate, alongside a small mound of potato salad on the side, the entire dish built from eggs that likely cost less than a nickel for the half dozen, bought straight from a farmer who delivered them himself. This was not a side dish here, not an afterthought tucked onto the edge of someone else's plate. This was the entire meal, dignified enough to stand completely on its own, built start to finish from the single cheapest protein available anywhere in that kitchen. Number 1. Tomato soup and saltines, Memphis, 10 cents, the cheapest plate on the entire menu, the one this whole list closes on, full circle back to the dime that started it all 25 items ago. Tomatoes simmered down slow with a little sugar to cut the acid and round out the flavor, a splash of cream stirred in right at the very end, off the heat, so it would never curdle against the hot liquid. Ladled into a thick white bowl with a sleeve of saltines set on the side, ready to be crumbled in or eaten dry, whichever way you preferred it. That was it. That was the entire dish, beginning to end, and somehow it was enough. Enough to fill a stomach, enough to warm a cold afternoon, enough to send a person back out the door satisfied. Grandma just called it soup and crackers. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Closing 25 plates. 25 dimes and quarters spent across a single decade, at counters that don't exist anymore in cities that mostly forgot they were ever there. Think about the cheeseburger deluxe, stacked high enough to need both hands. Think about the Frito chili pie, eaten straight out of the bag because nobody needed a dish to prove the food was good. Think about tomato soup and saltines, 10 cents, asking nothing of anyone and delivering everything anyway. These weren't simple meals because the cooks didn't know better. They were simple because every unnecessary step had already been argued out of the recipe by people who couldn't afford to waste time, money, or food. That is not poverty cooking. That is mastery, disguised as necessity, and we let an entire industry convince us it was something to be embarrassed about instead of something to mourn. The company that owned these counters sold off the marble and the stools, and didn't think to ask a single cook to write down a single recipe before the doors closed for good. That is not a footnote. That is the theft this whole list is built around. Tray 1 this week. Just one. The Frito pie, the toasted ham and cheese, the tomato soup. Pick whichever one your hands remember and make it the way it was actually made. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.